Hi there. I thought I'd present or produce this video on one of the golden oldies. This is called Seelöwe, the German invasion of Britain 1940. My edition is from 1974, and I believe this is originally in the Moves magazine. This, I think, came out in SPI Strategy and Tactics before, maybe 2 or 3 years prior. And there's a box edition, which I think this is. I've doctored the map so that I've not added anything, I've just colourised portions that weren't colourised, because previously you only had these colours and the blue. And so what you can see is the southern coastline of Great Britain. You have London here, you have my hometown of Bristol there. I have lived sort of here, here and about there. and along here are German invasion echelon boxes, or for their waves. The yellow are beach hexes. The red boxed are ports. So the Germans are aiming to capture 10, up to 10, and there's 14 ports in all along the coastline. To win a decisive victory, the Germans need 10, and to have at least parity in strength at the end of the game to the Brits. Otherwise, if the Brits have greater strength, the Germans will have a lesser victory, or if the Germans have, say, less than 5 ports and the Brits have greater strength, the Brits will have won a good victory and the Germans will have lost. And there's a draw in within that range. So these are sort of forest. This is highland. As I said, London. I've outlined them in the blue. That's a supply centre. You have a supply centre for the Brits. These are at Southampton and Bristol. Any 2 hex or larger city. That will be important later on. Now, there's 3 scenarios to the game. The first one is the OKH plan, which is the one I've played, and you see it set up here. Then there's the Navy plan, which has a different mix of starting units, at least for the Germans. I believe for the Brits as well. And then there's a fantasy scenario. The OKH and Navy plan will occur in September, and they go for this die roll on weather. Weather is very important for landing and for air operations. You have clear, you have rough, in which you can only land on ports. You have no or low visibility, so no air, and storms, there's no landing at all. And you can see in July there's more rough sea, so it's a bit harder for the Germans to land. Essentially, after the first wave, the Germans can land 1 unit at every port and 1 at every beach within these groupings. So you have grouping of A, B, C, D, E, F, and then if you're in the fancy scenario, you can land on this part. The game mostly plays out around this area of the map, because the game is 15 turns long. Each turn, I think, is 2 or 3 days, something like that. The idea is just to play until the Germans have either gained enough of a foothold to have a good chance or sort of certainty of victory in this invasion, or not. And so this expanse here is really for British reinforcements. There's these are the British reinforcements over the 15 game turns. They come on entrained, and so they can move along these train tracks, which you can see 30 hexes, which can bring them to about here and here and here. And so the Germans are aiming to grab at those ports and then build enough of a beachhead. So the first and last game, so I've only played it once, my Germans had a line here essentially, and they won a decisive victory, essentially because I didn't play the Brits well. The second game I would know more what to do with the Brits. So if you have the fantasy area, the Germans can come in here, so obviously that will open up more of this space. There'll probably be movings from here to there and so forth. Now you see at start the Brits have a scattering of units. They are all inactive, except for the ones marked which have higher movement rates. So these are kind of motorised and armoured units. Everyone else is flipped over and they're inactive, and they will only become activated on a roll of 1 or 2 every turn until game turn 5, by which, if there's any that are still unactivated, will become activated. So the Brits have a faltering response. It could be a bit stronger, a bit less, depending on how it pans out in the game you're playing against the German invasion. The Germans are guaranteed their first invasion. It just goes in. The weather is clear. After that, from game turn 2 to 6, you roll on this column. From 7 to 15, you roll on that column. And on a 1, 2, it's clear. And above, like I said, on 3, 4, rough, only landing at the ports. So you see there's a lot of beaches you can land on. But if you don't have ports, less of your follow-on waves would be able to land. And so essentially game turns 2 to 6 for the Germans. A third of the time everything's hunky-dory. Another third they can only land at ports, and the last third there's no landing and no air attacks. The air attacks are very important because the Germans, they start with 15. You actually have 15 units, but I've bunched them in groups like that because essentially 5+ units attacking, you're guaranteed a hit, a disruption, and all the time you can, on a 6 you will lose an air unit. So the game I played, the Germans had whittled down to 12 or 11 or 12 air by the end of the game, but I just like to guarantee my disruptions, because what you want to do is, we're in a shadow there, but these very strong units, most units for the Brits and the Germans that saw the majority around 6, 5, 4, but the Brits have 2 extremely strong ones. Oh, he's active at the start, and also they have these small 112 sort of brigades which can whiz in and plug gaps. They will basically sort of be sacrifice units. But you want to disrupt them because then they only have movement of 1 point, and if you attack them they're at half strength. So the Germans relying on heavy air cover, and the Brits only have 3 air. In this basic scenario they get 1 extra air on 6, and then another 4 on, no, they don't. That's it. So that's the most, and that's what I had. And so the Brits don't get much good use out of their air. They get sort of spotty occasional disruptions, which they want to pounce, and they're essentially looking to hold and take back ports, bring the Germans down to 5 or less ports if possible, and make sure they have greater strength than the Germans at the end. The Germans have these 2 massive stacks to bring in on game turn 6. So the game mainly hinges around this area, and it's extremely interesting. It's simple. I'll just sort of give you a broad sort of thought about it before I tell you a bit more about the sort of the pros and cons of it. First you've got terrain. Terrain's very simple. The Brits, terrain has no effect for movement. For the Germans, these ones add 1 extra MP, 1 extra movement point. And forest and river and cities affect combat, so you get a benefit there. The rules are, in this edition, they're in a fold out. They're pretty standard stuff. There's a few wrinkles, like you can move through zones of control, but only from EZOC, enemy zone of control, to enemy zone of control if you're a motorised unit. So they're very important. Otherwise, and it's 2 movement points to move into a zone of control, 1 to move out. So it does kind of slow down. You can kind of go into, you can sort of slightly pin the enemy units, and so manoeuvre is very important in the game. So I didn't give you a really good look. So it's pretty standard stuff. Stacking 2 units per hex plus a supply unit for the Germans. Air power, I showed you essentially how that works. They have 2 ranges, so 2 tables for that. So that's all the rules, and then here's how to set up the scenarios. This is all about the special landings, reinforcements, weather table, just some odd British units, and then victory. And then you have a very interesting thing, because because of the variability of the game, like the British may be unlucky on the activations, and or the Germans may be unlucky on the weather, and so not able to bring in extra waves. This is the basic scenario. On their first wave, so that's whatever at the end of the first turn you put in your first wave according to what's available in France, and that's the strength you can have. So 30 strength points. So you've got 9 6 strengths, 2 4 5s, and then you've got supply units which are equivalent of 3. You get 1 for free. So you have to decide. So you're going to sort of get 5 6 4s and just 1 supply, or a bit of a mixture. That will be your first wave. Then you put them in the echelons at the end of that turn, and then the next turn they can embark or debark rather in at the beginning of the next turn. So then you put them on the actual port or beach hex depending on the weather. So and it goes from 30 to 20 to 20 and the third wave, and then the fourth and fifth wave 60 60, and different from the other scenarios. So by the time you get there you can bring on 60 strengths worth of units, so that's 10 of those 5s and some other odds and so forth. If you have the weather. If you don't, you won't get that, and so the Germans might have only these units to hold on to turn 6. Maybe the weather's bad, because on turn 6 we're on here, so a third of the time you won't be able to land them. Turn 7, the same situation, but also the air will be out half of the time. And so because of that variability, you might just say, oh, I only lost the game because I was so unlucky, and you were lucky in how the activations and the weather turned out. So this has things which we don't, I think, see so much nowadays in war games, but maybe there was a little bit more of it before. You have match games, so it's like we play twice, switching sides, and then we compare our victories, or and then you can compare your victory on the evaluation of how good, how where are we? From British victory, technical draw, German marginal, German substantive, and German decisive. Or they also recommend a more accurate evaluation is by playing a match of each of the 3 scenarios. So not just one scenario twice, once each side, but all of them. And they also recommend, if you both have the game, you could actually play 2 different games concurrently. So while I'm moving as the Germans, you could be moving as the Brits, and then we swap on the other map. So it's very nice to sort of have that added in, and it works fine solitaire play because there's no hidden movement. Unactivated units can't move. The combat results table is interesting. So on the classic 3-to-1 odds, you get a minus on the die in the cities and rivers and forests. No, sorry, in the cities you ignore retreat results, but in the rivers and forests you get -2 on the die, hence you could go into that. But generally you're going to get both retreat, defender retreat, exchange, and that's not half exchange. So if the defender has a 6 and you have a 5 and a 3 attacking, then you'll lose both your 5s and 3s to equal their 6 that they have to lose in exchange. And a defender eliminated only on a 6. So that's what you're looking for. So below that, it's pretty unbloody. There's just retreats, and retreats are not too bad. You can retreat into zone of control if you have a friendly unit. So you do get benefits for surrounding units on attack, but generally the Brits are going to be attacking either on retreats. They're looking for at least defender retreats, so to shrink if they can't. If they're not eliminating German units, they want to shrink the bridgehead, and then then they can concentrate force more easily on weak points. And that essentially is what I was not doing with the Brits, which I have learnt for my next play. So apart from the details in the rules on embarkation and debarkation and so forth, it's all very simple and moves very straightforwardly. Essentially, I just needed the player turn the German, the British, because they're slightly differently, and then the landing procedures as main references, and then the rules and charts. And after that, I didn't need to look at the rule book much. So that's sort of the game in broad stroke. But then I'd like to list some of the things that I really like about it. The first thing, which is great, is the supply for the Germans and the limitation it puts on them for attacks. Now they start with 10 supply counters. Oops, they're going to get 10 more, and slightly different for different scenarios, but they're going to get 10 more on game turn 6. They also have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 coming in with their original landing. Now, they need these ones because without the Germans must be within 5 hexes to be in supply of one of these. Otherwise, they have to be within 3 hexes of a beach or port hex. So you can see that would enable very narrow breach heads, which different zones could not kind of support each other. If you have a supply here and a supply here, then units all across this range would be within supply. If you are up to 10 hexes away, then you're on. Then you're actually on unsupplied. Now you cannot attack, and your movement is halved. Any Germans above 10 hexes from one of these supply units is isolated, and they're also halved on defence. So you see, when they go in, the Germans can basically stay within 5, and if they have to, 10 hexes. That's too risky, and really you just wouldn't do that, because on half defence, then the Brits are just going to pounce on you, and the Germans need to retain as much strength as possible. So they're going to sort of stay within 5 hexes. The supply units move at 2 hexes a turn, obviously only 1 hex. All rough terrain costs 2 movement points for the Germans. So they're going to move out slowly to expand the bridgehead. But for every attack, the Germans have to expend a supply piece. So unless they sort of choose just a narrow front, so say they say, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So say they say, okay, we're just going to go for all these port hexes, and we'll forget about those 3 over there. That gives us 11. We want sort of 10, 6 at least to play with. Then they could sort of maybe, with their starting supply, if they can move that one, and if they can move that one over there, not really likely with the Brits moving. It depends though, because it depends on the activations. Then they might have 1 or 2 supplies available for combat, but otherwise they have to expend a supply on combat. You want to keep your units in supply, so what that means is the only supply they have for combat are these 4 coming in the next wave. Or you can send it in on the 2nd or 3rd wave. It's your choice, depending on if your combat units are more essential. Like I said before, you always can bring in at least 1 per wave for free. And then they don't get any more except for those 10 there. And then they don't get any more for the rest of the game. So what that tells you is the Germans probably have about 14 attacks a game. Now, the Brits have a good thing. The main thing you want the air for is if they can hit a supply unit as it is in echelon, waiting for it's coming across the channel, then that is sent back to France. It's not lost, but it is delayed. That gives them a main bonus. That's really what you want the Air Force for. The Air Forces, by the way, don't fight each other. That will keep that abstraction out of it. It's needless complexity. These Air Forces are for disrupting the ground. Otherwise, we just assume the Battle of Britain was won, but the Brits can still muster up a few pockets of air resistance here and there to muster a few sorties against the German. Probably supply train is what you'll be hitting as and when you can. That's certainly what I did as the Brits in the last game. But anyway, so it creates this exceedingly interesting situation that Germans probably have 14, maybe 15 or 16 if your bridgehead is smaller than mine was, or has shrunk for some reason in the whole game. So and you need to knock out strength of British units, or at least not have yours knocked out to get that decent ratio of your strength to the enemy strength at the end for the win. Now, I haven't calculated, it would be nice if they'd just done it in the rulebook, but just calculated, what is the total strength of the Brits that come on this unit and the total strength of the Germans. Obviously, I calculated it for the game that I won, and it panned out that way. That was the German remaining strength, that was the British. The British, a quick guesstimate, maybe had 150 maximum. So the Germans are bringing in more. So the British have the onus of destruction of the enemy upon them, whereas the Germans don't need that many attacks, but they're going to obviously have to use attacks, A, to expand their bridgehead, so that it's harder for the British to retake ports, and B, to, attack being the best form of defence. So that's the first thing that's really interesting about this game and makes it very different, apart from that, just the broad situation of the invasion. The second thing is the rhythm, and that is the thing that the Germans have an initial invasion, then they're probably going to 3/4 of the time, 2/3 of the time, sorry, they're going to get a second wave in the next term. It might be smaller than they hoped and only going on the ports, but they're going to be building up some momentum. But essentially they're going to come in strong and the Brits are weak and far away. And so they will have an initial surge, and then they have to hang on until they get the rest of their reinforcements. And the Brits don't have much reinforcements. These are for the other scenarios until then. So then the Germans get a surge, obviously if and when the weather permits, and can bring in all of those in the next few turns, as and when they can. But obviously then they get a massive surge, and that's what really won the game for me, because they only had 1 or 2 turns delay in bringing in all of those units. So you have this interesting rhythm. The Germans have the initial surge, then the Brits get their activations all done, of these beginning ones at least, by game turn 5. They're bringing in more, and they're finding out where the Germans weaker and starting to pick them off. And then the Germans get the next surge, and then the Brits steadily build up towards the end of the game and put the push on after that. As for the balance on the luck factor, it's essentially each turn you can reckon on 1/3 of the Brits activating up to game turn 5. And so you sort of balance that against the chances of the weather being good for the Germans. And then there's other really interesting things which I didn't realise to start. Like the Brits, their supply, they just trace it anywhere to the north edge, or either to, as I mentioned, London, Bristol or Southampton. And as long as it can be any distance, as long as they can trace it through enemy zones of control with a friendly unit in that hex, they are in supply. Otherwise they're counted as isolated, so half movement, half defence and no attacks. So that presents a very interesting situation, is that if the Brits can get any, and in fact they did in my game, they got units in here and they held this out almost to the end of the game. These units, even if completely surrounded, that will be a bastion of defence, because they will remain in supply. And the Germans have to muster a lot of units to make sure they don't waste one of their valuable supply counters on a mere, both retreat or, well, in fact, in cities, you ignore all retreat results. So they're going to need at least, say, 6-1 to give them the pretty much definite chance of knocking out a unit. And there's 2 of those. So that's a very interesting situation, the Southampton stronghold there. So that will be a focus for both players. And then the other thing is that the exchange results can produce big swings. So as I mentioned, you could be attacking a 3 enemy unit with, say, 2 of your 6s, for a 4-1, and then on an exchange they lose a 3 and you lose a 6. So in guaranteeing good combat results, you can risk those costly exchanges. And the way the victory conditions are, the way we're looking for a preponderance of strength in relation to our enemy, that's very important. So all these things make it an extremely interesting game to play, and like I think I said earlier, it plays very quickly. The system is smooth and easy. As a grognard, you won't have any trouble with it, and all I needed was this many notes to remind me of the particularities in this game on supply, zones of control, how they work, how disruption works, what holding a hex is, and also about the 1 hex minimum move, which how does that work? Is it possible? And it is, except from Ezok to Ezok, because those things are very special, especially when you're having it's a shame I can't show you my end game, but essentially you're sort of having walls of resistance around here, and enemy, not literal walls hex to hex, but cordons this way, and the cordons from the enemy looking for mustering mechanized troops and other troops for a breakthrough. And you have a mechanized movement phase in both turns, so those mechanized move units get a second move. And the Brits don't get many of them in this scenario. They have 1, 2, 3, 4, none in the reinforcements. Germans get lots, so I think I'd like to play it again, and I'd like to encourage any of you who have it or were thinking about it to give it a go. It's a delightful game. I think that's all I can say about this for now. I hope I didn't forget anything. Over and out.